There is a specific kind of loneliness that only exists in student neighborhoods. By day, these areas are vibrant, bursting with life, laughter, and the chaotic energy of thousands of young adults chasing their futures. But by night, when the street lamps flicker and the heavy rains fall, these tight-knit alleys transform. They become labyrinthine grids of concrete boxes, places where hundreds of strangers live side by side, divided only by thin drywall. It is an environment where you can hear your neighbor breathing through the wall, yet know absolutely nothing about their life. And sometimes, it is an environment where someone can completely vanish, and no one will notice until it's far too late. Imagine crawling on your hands and knees in the dim light of your room, reaching under your bed to grab a lost item. Your knuckles brush against the cold floor, but as you reach further into the shadows, your hand stops. Just inches from your face, standing perfectly still, is a pair of pale, bare female feet. There is no body attached to them, no torso, no face to scream back at you, just a pair of severed legs that suddenly begin to walk past your frozen body, stepping out into the dark hallway. This isn't an urban legend passed around a campfire. This is the terrifying breaking point that forced a young college student to abandon every single possession he owned: his clothes, his electronics, his identification, and run into the street in broad daylight, never to step foot in that neighborhood again. Tonight, we unravel the full 30-minute chronicle of the end room, a story that begins not with a ghost, but with a devastating human betrayal, a double fatality, and a lingering, fragmented entity that refuses to let the living rest. To understand the terror that took place in this building, we have to look back exactly 10 years before it was abandoned. The structure was a standard budget-friendly boarding house designed for struggling university students. 2 floors, 12 rooms in total, with a communal kitchen at the ground floor. It was always fully occupied due to its incredibly low rent. But architecturally, the building had a flaw. The second floor was designed as one long, straight, narrow corridor. If you stood at the top of the stairs, you looked down a dark tunnel, and at the absolute end of that tunnel, hidden around a slight blind corner, was the final room, Room 6. In the late autumn of that year, Room 6 was occupied by a final-year university student. According to the few statements gathered from the landlord and neighbors later on, she was an intensely introverted soul. While other students gathered in the courtyard to play music or study together, she slipped past like a shadow. She was dealing with the immense pressure of her final thesis, but beneath that academic stress lay a much darker, hidden burden. She was secretly in a relationship with a wealthy student from a prominent family. It was a relationship kept in the dark, away from public view, and halfway through her final semester, she discovered she was pregnant. When she confessed the news to her partner, expecting support, the illusion shattered. Fearing the stain on his family's reputation and his own future, the man vanished. He changed his number, blocked her from his life, and left the neighborhood entirely. Left completely alone, facing societal shame, financial ruin, and the crushing weight of isolation at the end of that dark hallway, the young woman's mind broke. She didn't seek help. She didn't call her family. She locked the door of Room 6, pulled the curtains shut, and surrendered to the dark. For nearly 2 weeks, none of the other residents thought anything of her absence. They assumed she was locked away studying for finals, or perhaps had gone back to her hometown. It wasn't until a suffocating, sweet, and pungent odor began to seep from beneath the doorway of room 6 that the landlord was finally called. When the door was forced open, the community was changed forever. She was found lying on her bed, long passed away, surrounded by empty bottles of high-proof alcohol. The subsequent medical examination revealed the dual tragedy. She had passed away alongside her unborn child. The grief and anger she felt in her final moments were poured entirely into the floorboards of that room. Following the police investigation, the room was cleared. A heavy iron padlock was placed on the door, and the landlord tried his best to bury the memory of what happened. But energy cannot be destroyed, it can only be trapped. Exactly 1 year after the tragedy, memories began to fade, as they always do in transient student towns. Old students graduated, new ones arrived, and the horrific story of Room 6 became nothing more than a whispered myth told to frighten freshmen. Because of the stigma, the landlord kept the rent of the boarding house incredibly low to attract outsiders who didn't know the local history. Enter a young Mana freshman from a remote province, entirely focused on his studies and tight on money. He stumbled upon an advertisement for room 5, located right next to the padlocked, vacant end room. Unaware of the double fatality that occurred just inches on the other side of his wall, he signed the lease and moved his belongings in. For the first few weeks, everything seemed normal. But a house that has witnessed a violent emotional death does not stay quiet for long. The haunting of the end room did not begin with a terrifying apparition. It began with subtle, psychological decay. The new tenant began experiencing severe insomnia within his first month. Every night, precisely as the clock struck midnight, a sudden, unnatural drop in temperature would occur in room 5. It wasn't the pleasant chill of a late-night breeze. It was a heavy, damp, bone-chilling cold that felt like stepping into an underground crypt. Then came the auditory shifts. As he sat at his desk studying into the early hours of the morning, he would hear a faint sound coming from the other side of his closet wall, the wall shared with the locked room 6. It sounded like someone gently weeping, a low, rhythmic, breathless sob of a woman, followed by the distinct sound of liquids shifting like bottles rolling across a wooden floor. He tried to convince himself it was just the old pipes of the building or the wind howling through the cracks of the abandoned balcony. He even mentioned it to the landlord, who nervously laughed it off, claiming the end room was completely empty and used only for storing old mattresses. But the house was waking up, and soon the phenomenon would leak out of the walls and into the corridor. The true horror began to concrete itself during the midterm season. Exhausted by the heavy academic workload, the tenant invited his cousin over to stay the night so they could collaborate on an intensive group project. By 11 o'clock that evening, the rest of the building's occupants had either gone to sleep or left for the weekend. The silence inside the house was absolute. The only audible sound was the violent scratching of a large Cambogia tree branch against the side window of the corridor. As they sat working, the cousin stopped writing. He looked around the room, rubbing his arms, and noted how abnormally freezing the air had become. The tenant tried to calm his cousin down, finally admitting that for the past few weeks, the vacant room next door had been emitting strange noises. The moment those words were spoken into the air, the ambient sounds of the night died. The wind outside seemed to stop. From the far end of the corridor, right outside the padlocked door of room 6, a sound broke the silence. It was the unmistakable sound of bare feet dragging heavily across the dusty floor tiles. The pace was agonizingly slow. Step by step, the dragging sound moved down the straight hallway, passing the empty rooms, until it stopped dead directly outside the door of room 5. The two young men froze, staring at the bottom gap of the door. There were no shadows of feet blocking the light from the hallway, yet the presence on the other side was undeniable. 3 slow, perfectly timed knocks vibrated through the wood of the door. Gathering his courage, believing it might be a neighbor playing a sick prank, the tenant reached out, turned the handle, and pulled the door open. The corridor was empty. The air was thick with a foul, decaying odor. A smell that the tenant later described as a mixture of sour alcohol and stagnant water. Down at the blind end of the hall, the neon bulb was violently flickering, casting long, erratic shadows. But, as they stepped out to look closer, their breath left their bodies. Standing directly in front of the padlocked door of room 6 was a figure. It was a woman, her back completely turned toward them. Her jet black hair hung loosely down to her waist, tangled and unwashed. She wore a stained, white Dastra traditional house dress that was completely drenched from the knees down, dripping dark fluid onto the floor tiles. From her throat came that same weeping sob he had heard through the walls. But out here in the open, it was sharp, agonizing, and filled with an ancient, unresolved grief. The cousin, trembling uncontrollably, whispered out into the dark, asking if she needed help. The entity stopped crying, slowly, with terrifying, mechanical, jerky movements, like a neck being violently forced to rotate her head, began to turn around to face them. But, before her facial features could emerge from the shadow of her hair, the flickering neon bulb directly above her violently exploded. Sparks showered the floor, plunging the entire second floor into pitch-black darkness. The two boys scrambled backward into room 5, slamming the door shut and throwing every lock into place. They spent the remaining 5 hours of the night pushed against the far wall, listening to the sound of fingernails frantically clawing at the outside wood of their door, accompanied by a low, rhythmic tapping that lasted until the first light of dawn broke through the window. After that horrific night, I begged my cousin to pack his bags and break his lease immediately. But human psychology is strange. We have an innate desire to rationalize the impossible. He convinced himself it was a group hallucination brought on by sleep deprivation and stress. He decided to give it until the end of the semester. It was a mistake that almost cost him his sanity. Exactly 3 months into his tenancy, on a gloomy afternoon around 4 o'clock, the haunting reached its terrifying physical climax. The sky outside was covered in a thick blanket of storm clouds, casting the bedroom into a deep twilight. The tenant was preparing to leave for an evening basketball practice on campus. He was fully dressed in his athletic gear, but his basketball was missing from its usual corner. Searching the dim room, he noticed the ball had rolled deep into the pitch-black void beneath his bed frame. He knelt on the floor, flat against his stomach, and stretched his arm out into the darkness under the mattress. His fingers were just an inch away from the leather texture of the ball. Suddenly, without warning, the ball jerked. It was violently pushed from the deep, hidden side of the wall, rolling out from under the bed and hitting the side of his wooden wardrobe. Startled, the tenant shifted his position on the floor, still resting on his knees, turning his head toward the wardrobe to see where the ball had landed. His entire body went rigid. His vocal cords paralyzed themselves. Right there, standing just 3 inches away from his face, was a pair of female feet. They were pale, completely devoid of blood flow, yet perfectly clean and well kept, resting inside a pair of thin, fabric house slippers. For one beautiful, desperate second, his brain tried to tell him it was a female classmate who had walked in through the unlocked door to borrow a textbook. But as his eyes slowly traveled upward, past the ankles, past the calves, the illusion dissolved into pure horror. The legs ended abruptly at the knees. There was no upper body, no torso, no arms, no head. It was a floating, truncated manifestation, a pair of severed calves standing upright on the concrete floor, existing in a pocket of warped reality. As he lay frozen on the ground, the severed legs began to move. They took slow, deliberate steps past his head. The sound of the slippers hitting the floor was terrifyingly loud in the small room. The entity walked smoothly out of the open bedroom door, stepped into the corridor, and marched down the hallway toward the end room, passing directly through the solid wood of the padlocked door of room 6. The psychological dam broke. The young man didn't scream. He didn't grab his keys, his money, or his phone. He scrambled to his feet, ran out of the building in a state of pure hysteria, and collapsed into the arms of his friends at a nearby campus cafe. He was so deeply traumatized that he refused to ever enter the alleyway again. It took 5 of his classmates, moving in a tight group during the brightest hour of the following Sunday afternoon, to retrieve his clothes and belongings so he could officially sever his contract. When the neighborhood locals watched the group of students frantically moving the boys' things out of the house, no one asked questions. The elders of the alley simply watched from their porches, nodding in a grim, collective understanding. They had seen this cycle repeat itself 3 times before. As my cousin walked out of the front gate for the last time, carrying his final box of textbooks, an elderly man who had lived in the adjacent house for 40 years stepped forward. He looked at my cousin's pale face, lit a cigarette, and spoke with a calm, chilling certainty. The old man told him he was fortunate. He was fortunate because he had only seen the fragments, the echoes of her memory, trapped inside the room. Because according to the longtime residents of the alley, on the nights when the moon is hidden and the rain turns cold, the manifestation changes. If you walk down that alleyway past midnight and look up at the second floor window of room 6, you will see her. Not a fragment, but the entire, unbroken silhouette of the young woman, sitting perfectly still on the outer ledge of the window frame. She doesn't look at the sky, and she doesn't look at the building. Her eyes are locked entirely on the entrance of the alley below. She is trapped in an eternal loop of consciousness, entirely unaware that time has passed, entirely unaware that her physical body is gone. She is simply waiting, waiting for the footsteps of the man who promised her a life together, waiting for a phantom lover who will never return. Shortly after my cousin's departure, the remaining tenants in the building experienced identical terrors, the sound of a child crying in the ventilation pipes, the weeping at midnight, and the phantom footsteps in the hall. Within 2 months, the entire boarding house was cleared out. Today, the building stands hollow, a rotting concrete monument to a fatal betrayal. The landlord has abandoned all attempts to sell or renovate the property, as no construction crew will stay past sundown. The locals believe that as long as those walls remain standing, the energy of that double fatality will never dissipate. She'll stay there, suspended in her grief, waiting by the window, waiting in the dark corners, under the beds, waiting for a closure that the living can no longer provide.